Bonjour tout le monde et merci d'être venu. Aujourd'hui, je vais vous présenter en anglais un petit travail qu'on a fait. I'll speak in English. So, my name is Kalondé. I'm a PhD student in my second year, and I'll be presenting to you on the prevalence and correlates of violence against Zambian female sex workers. And this is work that was presented in part at the last year's AIDS conference in Amsterdam. And this work hasn't yet been published, but it's under review, internal review for publication. Okay, so just giving you a bit of context, setting the scene a bit for what's to come. This graphic you see here is the global burden of disease among women of reproductive age. And I'll just highlight here the role of HIV, which accounts for 11%, roughly 11% of global burden of disease resulting in death. This is around the world. Now I'm going to show you a graphic, similar graphic, but this time showing the burden of disease among Zambian women. And there you see the difference. So HIV among Zambian women of reproductive age accounts for 45% of deaths, which is 4 times higher than the global average. So it's clear that this is a significant public health issue in Zambia. I'm also going to highlight here violence, which accounts for roughly 1% of deaths among Zambian women of reproductive age, which may not seem like a lot, but the perspective changes when you look at the interaction between violence and HIV, which I'll do during the course of this presentation. So Zambia, besides being the country of my birth, is also a country with a generalized HIV epidemic. Its prevalence of 11.5% is the 7th highest in the world. And I think you all agree that that's not a competition any country would like to be doing well in. Another epidemic that exists is a concentrated epidemic among female sex workers. And recent estimates place their HIV prevalence at 56%. It could be higher or lower because there aren't that many studies in Zambia that have been conducted at documenting the prevalence among female sex workers. So it could be higher or lower. Another epidemic that exists in Zambia is that of violence against women. And this is clearly highlighted here with women of reproductive age again reporting 43% prevalence of physical violence. Okay. Something else I'd like to talk about in the context of Zambia is that sex work is actually legal. It's not illegal, even though police do continue to round up and arrest female sex workers, not for practicing sex work, but on charges related to sex work, usually petty charges like loitering, which as a result means that even though sex work is not illegal, it's still heavily criminalized. I'm going to talk a bit about sex work and client violence. There isn't much literature. There are only few published studies on sex work and violence in Zambia. But from what has been published, here's what we know. In a survey amongst male clients of female sex workers, clients that were interviewed were males who have views, who express views or attitudes in favor of violence against women. And in qualitative studies that have been conducted among female sex workers, the female sex workers reported experiencing physical, sexual, and psychological violence from their male clients. There is also a culture of criminalization and stigmatization against female sex workers in the Zambian context, which means that even if a female sex worker does experience violence, she'd be very reluctant to go to the police because of fear of prosecution or being arrested, which means that the police paradoxically represent the major entry point into violence prevention and victim support services, so she'd be very isolated in this case. And obviously the effects, there are downstream effects of violence which range from mental to sexual and reproductive health issues. So is there a relationship between violence and HIV? I asked this question because at some of the recent conferences I've attended, I've been interrogated on this subject, and people have come up to me and said, well, Kalondé, you're studying HIV, you're in the field of HIV, why are you looking at violence? Is there a relationship between HIV and violence? Well, the short answer to that is yes, there is. The longer answer is that there are several mechanisms by which violence interacts with HIV. First of these being indirect mechanisms. We have the notion, I think, we tend to think that violence only occurs on an in-person, person-to-person basis, which is not true. Violence can also be institutional. I'll give an example. Bearing in mind what I said before, that sex work is stigmatized in the country, if a female sex worker wants to access a health facility for healthcare services, and the healthcare providers deny her access to the healthcare facility, she might be foregoing treatment, condom provision, or health education, all of which could place the female sex worker at an elevated risk of acquiring HIV. And then I'll speak to more direct mechanisms by which violence interacts with HIV. And I'll take here the example of client violence, which I'll be focusing on during this presentation. So we know from the literature that when a female sex worker is confronted with violence, she has less agency to negotiate condom use with her violent client. And in that same situation, the client, during a forced sexual act, is less likely to use a condom. And this elevates the risk of HIV acquisition for both parties, both client and female sex worker, in both directions. So on this basis, we developed, well, we designed a study, and we developed two research questions. First of which was, what's the prevalence of client-initiated violence against female sex workers in our cohort? And the second of which is, what are the factors associated with this violence? Moving on to the methods. Okay, so this study, the sex worker study that I analyzed, that I worked on, was conducted in Zambia at the Zambia Emory HIV Research Project, which is an organization that's based in both the capital city of Lusaka, which has roughly 2.5 million inhabitants, probably closer to 3 million now, but unofficially 2.5 million, and Ndola, the smaller Copperbelt province city, which has roughly 500,000 inhabitants. That's where the study took place. And I actually used to work here. I worked there for a few years before coming here. The inclusion criteria for this study were being aged 18 to 45 and being a sex worker, which was defined in our questionnaire as exchanging sex for money. And in total, 419 women met the inclusion criteria for this study and were eligible for analysis. And also worth mentioning that they were recruited by their peers. That means fellow sex workers. Data for the study was collected between the end of 2012 and mid-2015 through the means of face-to-face interviews that were conducted by medical personnel trained in HIV psychosocial counseling. And the questionnaires, you'll see a little snapshot there of one of the questionnaires, were administered in either English or one of the local languages. So Nyanja, which is predominantly spoken in Lusaka, or Bemba, which is predominantly spoken in Ndola. As I mentioned before, it's a cross-sectional study, cross-sectional data. What was our outcome? Well, we asked female sex workers in our cohort if they had ever been physically struck or hit by one of their male clients, to which they responded yes or no. This is a binary outcome, Therefore, we conducted multiple logistic regression to find the factors associated with violence, and from that method we computed adjusted odds ratios and confidence intervals. What variables did we test? The answer is a lot, not all displayed on the slide, but just to give you an idea, we looked at a few things. I've given you 4 categories here of what we looked at. Under demographics, we looked at age, level of education. Under sexual history, we looked at their age, the first time they had sex, and also their age, the first time they had sex for money. And we also looked at several behavioral variables, which include the consumption of alcohol, STI results, number of clients they saw the previous month, condom use with clients, and obviously environmental variables as well, where they live, where they recruit their clients, and also where they have sex with their clients. So moving on to the results. I developed a profile of what the typical woman in our cohort looked like based on those 4 categories I highlighted just before. And under demographics, you see that typically median age was 24 and low levels of education. Most women were educated only up to primary school level. And under sexual history, 17 was the median age at entry in sex work. And the median number of years of experience in the sex work profession was 5 years. Under behavior, we saw that female sex workers saw a median of 10 clients each month, and consistent condom use with clients was very low at 20%. Then in the environment, these were multiple response questions, so yes or no questions to different areas. Female sex workers revealed that they mostly recruit clients from bars and the street, and they revealed that they service clients, which means have sex with their clients, mostly in lodges or the client's home. In terms of our principal outcome, 39% of women in our cohort reported ever experiencing physical violence at the hands of their clients. 39%, which is quite high. In terms of the factors associated with this violence, I've got a little graphic there showing all the factors associated, significantly associated with violence based on the analyses that we performed. And I've just broken them down into 3 categories, first of which being environmental variables. So having sex in the client's home, and practicing sex work in Lusaka, and recruiting clients from the street were the 3 environmental variables significantly associated with client-initiated physical violence. We have also under sexual history, having a forced sexual debut, meaning being forced to have sex the first time they ever had sex. This was also significantly associated with violence. And then we had behavioral variables, which were the number of clients seen the previous month, and we noticed an increased odds of violence with increasing number of clients. I'm going to go into more detail now on each of these variables. So we found that female sex workers who had sex with their clients in the client's home had close to a 3-fold increase in odds of encountering violence versus those who said they didn't have sex in the client's home. And going by the literature, this could potentially be explained by the 3 interplaying aspects of control, concealment, and isolation. So in his own home, a client is more likely to feel in control in the knowledge that any act of violence that he commits will be concealed from the public. Whereas in the same situation, a female sex worker is likely to feel isolated from any possible help or intervention in the event of any such violence. This could potentially explain why we saw greater odds of violence in the client's home. As for practicing sex work in Lusaka, we noticed that female sex workers who said they practiced sex, who lived in Lusaka and practiced sex work in Lusaka, had over 2 times greater odds of experiencing violence than female sex workers who were based in Ndola. Potential explanation for this, if you think back to what I mentioned earlier, Lusaka is a much bigger, much more urbanized city than Ndola is, much bigger population as well. We know from the literature that rapid urbanization in developing settings can actually increase socioeconomic disparities like low income or poor housing, and this may in turn reinforce existing gender norms that express attitudes in favor of violence against women. We also had, this was the only variable, recruiting clients from the street, that had actually a protective effect against violence. So female sex workers who recruited clients from the street had lower odds of violence than female sex workers who didn't recruit from the street. It's very difficult to interpret this variable or to make much sense of it, because we only looked at client violence, and we know that female sex workers who are street-based are prone to other forms of violence that aren't necessarily client violence, like police violence, for instance. So difficult to read too much into this variable here. We also found, obviously, that having a physically forced sexual debut versus engaging willingly the first time you had sex increased the odds of violence in our cohort. And this could be, well, this is consistent with the literature that says that actually being abused in childhood could inadvertently actually create a tolerance to further abuse in adulthood amongst victims. Finally, there's the number of clients seen. This was the only behavioral variable. We found that in relation to female sex workers who saw 8 clients or fewer per month, those who saw between 9 and 19 or greater than 20 per month had progressively increasing odds of experiencing violence. And this could be potentially explained by the fact that if men who pay for sex tend to be men with views in favor of violence against women, it goes to say that if female sex workers have more encounters with these men, they're at a higher risk of encountering violence from them. Okay, so the limitations of our study. First one is that due to the cross-sectional nature of our study, we cannot infer causality. It wasn't a longitudinal study, it was purely based on baseline data. So we developed associations and correlates. Second is that because the outcome, violence, was self-reported by participants, it's subject to what's known as social desirability bias, which is something that occurs when respondents say what they think the researchers or interviewers want to hear versus what they actually know to be true. That could have influenced, that could have played a part here, but that was minimized by experienced counselors and well-trained counselors actually administering these questionnaires. We also only looked at physical violence, whereas there are other forms of violence such as sexual violence and psychological violence that exist. And we only looked at clients as perpetrators. We know that intimate partners in the police are also perpetrators of violence against female sex workers. So in conclusion, I just drew up a few take-homes. We found that sexual environment, sexual history, and sexual behavior are all important predictors or correlates of violence against female sex workers in Zambia. Potential recommendations on the policy side, I would think it would be good to sanction safe and regulated workspaces for female sex workers to allow them to engage with clients in a safer manner. I'd also potentially suggest interventions for adolescent girls to protect them from abuse, and for young men and also clients of female sex workers to discourage them from abuse against women. And then the final one I'd suggest with reluctance is that risk reduction counseling include, highlight the dangers of high client volume. This might be difficult to implement, seeing as female sex workers tend to come from low income background, low levels of education, so they might be seeing high numbers of clients so that they can earn more money to feed themselves and their families. So that would be more difficult to implement. I also wanted to add a next step slide, because even though this work is going to be published, I wouldn't like that to be the end point, because the reason why I'm in research is so my work can have an impact on the ground level with the communities. So with that in mind, I approached the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative, who funded the study, and the Zambia Emory HIV Research Project, who conducted the study, with the idea of creating a guideline or toolkit for HIV prevention amongst female sex workers. And the target audience would be hopefully communities and law enforcement. Discussions around this are very much still ongoing, very much in their infancy, but I hope the outcome will be, well, as I hope it to be. And just to finish, I'd like to acknowledge a few parties: SESSTIM for housing me and offering me the opportunity to conduct my PhD here in Marseille, ZERP for conducting the study, Emory for authorizing my use of the data, IAVI for funding the sex worker study, and Aix-Marseille University and Amidex for paying me to be here. And lastly, if I have enough time, I'd like to end with a quote, which for me is quite pertinent. It's by Carol Maguire, and it says, "Considering sex work as a crime is a large part of the reason it leads to abuse of women. Since it's the oldest profession, I don't believe we'll eliminate it, and therefore ought to make it safer for the people involved." Thank you very much.